There is an object hidden in the sky. It has been here many times. In ancient times, it was known as the Phoenix. It is approaching perihelion. It is located at 23.5 degrees north of the ecliptic and is presently in descending node. On May 15th, 2040, it will return. On May 16th, our world will be a very different place. This is an audio reading of When the Sun Darkens, the very first book in modern times about the Phoenix phenomenon, published by Booktree of San Diego in the year 2009. Chapter 1. The Existence of Planet Phoenix. Absolutely nothing is being added to the sum of knowledge as a result of original research. Indeed, not even the discoveries made by people long ago are thoroughly assimilated. This was written 2,000 years ago by Pliny in Natural History, Universe and the World. The legend of the Phoenix is of particular antiquity. The old stories of the Phoenix held that it began as a great bird in the heavens that immersed into the sun with red plumage, but that it underwent a transformation into a flaming, leaping star. Zecharia Sitchin provides evidence that the ancients associated Phoenix to a great spherical object that appeared on the horizon, a mysterious celestial creature that appeared only every 500 or so years. The legend was universal. It has now been determined that every Native American culture from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego preserves stories concerning a gigantic bird so huge it darkened the sun. The concept of the phoenix seems to be a Greek preservation of Egyptian scientific records. A leading authority of Greek studies, Robert Graves, wrote that Phoenix is the masculine form of Phonisa, a title for the moon, meaning the red or bloody one. This fact is an astronomical relic preserved in the garb of fable, like the red and gold plumage of the phoenix, for as we will learn in this work, when planet Phoenix transits between the Earth and the Sun, it casts a dark red shadow over the moon. The link between Phoenix and Phoenicia is quite apparent. Chroniclers long ago, like Horapollo, used the term Phoenix and Phoenician interchangeably for someone who returned after a long journey. The earliest stories of Phoenix are associated with the person and reign of Enoch, who was a prophet, astronomer, king, and then an emperor. He was in fact the first to reign over an empire, and the title Phoenix is the Greek form of the Egyptian Pahanok, or House of Enoch. The historian Frederick Haberman notes that the Phoenician chronicler Sanchuniathon, writing about 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago, recorded that Phoenix was once a man. The connection between this enigmatic phenomenon and this pre-flood chronologist will be made more apparent later in this work. It is sufficient to understand at this point that the appearance of Phoenix to our predecessors had everything to do with the change of kingship instigated by the darkening of the solar orb by some vast object. Long ago, the authority of a king was made known by his seal. A tablet bearing an official message from the throne was stamped with the seal of the king. Ancient seals were adorned with images relative to the importance of their owners. Scholars of Near East studies have noted that at various points in history among the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian dynasties, the kings of Mesopotamia employed the royal seal of the winged disc. Sitchin, in his fervor to provide evidence of the Anunnaki planet Nibiru, assumes throughout his works that depictions of the winged disk concern this Anunnaki planet. It may, in many early depictions of our solar system found among Mesopotamian ruins, the winged planet is prominently displayed as a member of this system. And we are not to confuse planet Phoenix with the real and extremely distant planet Nibiru brought to the world's attention by Sitchin. Planet Phoenix had its own special representations, always depicted with wings. It was the artistic Mesopotamian reliefs and seals that gave rise to the belief by later generations that Phoenix was an immense celestial bird, so colossal that when it immersed into the sun, represented by the disk, the solar orb would go dark. The Phoenix bird was thought to resurrect because after a protracted period of time, the whole sun darkening episode would reoccur. The artist depicted Phoenix discs with wings because this was a way to convey that unlike the other planets of the known solar system, planet Phoenix flew a different course that those common wanderers of the ecliptic plane did not. Before we continue, it is important that the reader not make the mistake of assuming that this book is about Nibiru, masked by a different name. The Nibiru that Sitchin writes about is a gigantic world, the origin of the Anunnaki, with an orbital chronology very different than planet Phoenix. Sitchin does not give us a definitive timeline for this ancient world, but for the interested in reviewing it, for those interested, see my work titled Anunnaki Homeworld, the orbital history and 2046 AD return of planet Nibiru. The erudite and meticulous historian Pliny the Elder truly believed that one can know a lot about something and still not quite understand it. His epic work titled Natural History is today internationally esteemed. His source materials including 147 Roman writers and 327 foreign authors. He was known to write down excerpts of all his books he studied, and his personal philosophy was that every book had something that he could benefit from. His penetrating research led him to conclude that throughout the span of human history, there transpired ominous and long drawn-out eclipses of the sun, and that their cause was hidden by the rarity of their occurrence, and for this reason, they are not understood. Pliny added that these strange darkenings of the sun were quite natural and that they transpired at fixed times. Today, historians and scientific antiquarians gloss over these references, claiming that Pliny merely discoursed about regular eclipses, the transit of the moon between the earth and sun. But Pliny does not mention that the moon is what darkens the sun, a significant fact that such a penetrating researcher would not have omitted. In his work, he dedicates time to eclipses and the moon, but sets apart these other darkenings as the effect of something different. As it will be demonstrated herein, eclipses by the moon have nothing to do with what the ancients recorded. Interestingly, Pliny foreknew that his findings would be disbelieved, basing his observation on the predictability of human behavior. He wrote that the majestic things of nature lack credibility because men see things in piecemeal, refusing to put the entire picture together using the pieces that are available to them. Though Pliny could foresee the future disbelief of critics, he could not have foreseen that his own death would be connected in a most astonishing way to these long drawn-out eclipses he wrote about. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted violently and buried the Roman luxury cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii under several feet of ash and pumice. During the chaos, Pliny received notice that a female friend was in distress and required his assistance. He drew near to the volcano on a ship in his attempt to rescue, and probably from an acute and inquisitive mind as well. Sadly, he was never seen again. The Roman historian died in the area of Herculaneum and Pompeii by the wrath of Vesuvius, never suspecting that directly below these Roman cities were the entombed remains of an even more ancient civilization, cities that themselves had been buried alive by Vesuvius in the year 1687 BC, the exact year Phoenix transited, darkening the sun, initiating worldwide quakes and volcanism, as we will discover. For his time, Pliny represented the epitome of human knowledge of the world and the universe. Like Aristotle before him, he believed that all learning proceeds entirely or partially by things that are previously known. But there was a man even before Pliny who in all the ways that make a sage was a man before his time. His name was Lucretius, and his work is preserved in the 7,400-line poem titled On the Nature of the Universe. Lucretius died in 54 BC, over half a century before Pliny was born. The year of his death in 54 BC was also noted for a peculiar rain of spongy iron that afflicted Lucania. Lucretius adhered to the philosophy that the unseen things of the world could be discovered by studying what was seen. He is famous today for his theory that the entire universe is composed of infinitely tiny atoms, a fact now of course proven. Lucretius was troubled by the assertions of some that the world was very old because the whole sum of Greek knowledge of the past merely spanned back to the Theban and Trojan Wars, 1244 to 1229 BC. He further wrote that the history of the world was one of earthquakes that caused entire cities with their citizens to sink to the bottom of the seas, and that the great flood that destroyed whole races of men was only one cataclysm in the cycle of quakes. Lucretius' most incredible statement is that some unknown body, not the moon, passes over the surface of the sun and darkens the earth at a fixed time. Lucretius' writings were more specific than Pliny's, the former detailing the effect and the latter explaining the cause of the sun darkenings, that something passes over the surface of the sun. Lucretius wrote that an object passed between Earth and the sun, while Pliny mentions that these were long, drawn-out eclipses. While Pliny only infers that this phenomenon was not caused by the moon, Lucretius is more direct. Scholars today vehemently assert that references like these always refer to the moon. Their position is untenable, however. This explanation is held because of the obvious fact that in the known solar system, only two planets transit between the Earth and Sun, those being Mercury and Venus. Both of these through a telescope are viewed against the backdrop of the glowing sun as tiny dots passing over the surface of the fiery orb. But this assertion presupposes that the object darkening the sun travels along the ecliptic with the other known planets. As the pseudo-mythical evidence has already revealed, planet Phoenix is flying a different path off the ecliptic plane and travels far away from the inner solar system. The hypocrisy of the modern scientific world is abundantly evident in their prejudice against the statements of these men, Lucretius and Pliny. While these philosopher-historians are accredited today with the discovery of so many modern concepts and ideas, they are also accused of not comprehending the simple mechanics of an eclipse caused by the moon. This hypocrisy is amplified by the curious fact that it is largely held by the establishment that the phenomenon of eclipses was actually discovered over 500 years before Lucretius or Pliny were even born. Thales of Miletus was accredited with this, and his story is yet another strange coincidence in the history of Phoenix. The renowned father of history, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, in his book, The Histories, wrote that Thales of Miletus was of Phoenician by remote descent. He is named among the 7 wise men of Greece. Thales was the first among the Greeks to travel to Egypt and receive scientific instruction. Hieronymus of Rhodes said that Thales was an independent researcher, having never had a teacher until he studied in Egypt and associated with the priestly colleges. Thales lived from 640 to 546 BC. On his return from Egypt, he founded the Ionian school of astronomy and philosophy. He is thought to be the originator of algebra, and he taught that the stars were solids as well as the sun and moon. Thales knew that the moon's light was borrowed from the sun by reflection, comprehending that the moon disappeared when the earth cut off the sun's light, lunar eclipse. He was further aware of the sphericity of the earth. There can be no doubt that Thales was an initiate to a secret corpus of astronomical information concerning the Phoenix. He knew more than Lucretius or Pliny, for Thales was in possession of the knowledge of this mysterious object's actual orbital period. In the 4th year of the 48th Olympiad, Thales predicted that the sun would darken for a period of time after the passage of 2 years. His prediction was made in 585 BC. He knew this would transpire in what translates into our modern calendar as 583 BC in the reign of Alyattes, king of Lydia, but he merely foretold the year, not the day. This fact alone proves that Thales predicted something unusual, not an eclipse. Again, this is glossed over by the thinkers of our time. But what cannot be ignored is what occurred in 583 BC, in accord with a specifically fixed time. Chapter 2. Age of the Phoenix and Cycle of Cataclysm. Time is measured not by the calendar, but by the events that occupy it. Lewis Mumford, Technics and Civilization. Thales lived along the western coast of Asia Minor in Ionia, not far from the ruins of Troy. The empire of his day was Lydia, and by 583 BC, King Alyattes of Lydia had been engaged in a war against the Medes of the east at the eastern edge of Mesopotamia. This date is exactly 3 years after King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in the days of Daniel the prophet and Jeremiah. Persia was growing and would soon overcome the might of Babylon once it allied to Media. This is the backdrop behind this most unusual event. Sun darkening of 583 BC. Herodotus had traveled throughout the ancient world of Greece, the Aegean, Asia Minor, Syria, Babylonia, Persia, Phoenicia, and Egypt, collecting accounts about everything interesting that different peoples believed. He was meticulous, and his discoveries and the histories of various nations were recorded for all posterity in his world-famous Histories. An extensive time now over 24 centuries old. He wrote, "My business is to record what people say, but I am by no means bound to believe it." With the casual grace of a patient historian, Herodotus set out the following facts. War subsequently broke out between the two countries and continued for 5 years, during which both Lydians and Medes won a series of victories. One battle was fought at night. But then, after 5 years of indecisive warfare, a battle took place in which the armies had already engaged when day was suddenly turned to night. This change from daylight to darkness had been foretold to the Ionians by Thales of Miletus, who fixed the date for it in the year in which it did in fact take place. Both Lydians and Medes broke off the engagement when they saw the darkening of the day, for they were more anxious than they had been to conclude peace, and a reconciliation was brought about by Senecinus of Cilicia. Herodotus mentions 3 times in this abbreviated passage that the sun darkened, and not once did he refer to the moon. As eclipses in those days were well known, but not with predictive value, it was equally known that it was the moon that caused very short-lived momentary darknesses. Regular eclipses were recorded by Herodotus, and in these episodes the learned historian clearly mentions the moon. As Xerxes of Persia marched toward Greece, as recorded by Herodotus, the moon eclipses the sun for a short time. The Persians welcomed the omen as portending their victory over the West, which venerated the sun as opposed to the lunar veneration of Persia and the Eastern nations. This occurred just prior to the Battle of Salamis, where, in contradiction to their interpretation of the eclipse, they were defeated by the Hellenic League Greek city-states led by the warlike Spartans in that year of 481 BC. Herodotus clearly perceived the difference from the 481 BC eclipse involving the moon and the sun darkening event that stopped a raging battle in mid-career in 583 BC. Both Thales and Herodotus have to their credit the support of the unusually intelligent and critical thinker Aristotle, who acknowledges both men as his scientific predecessors. Now, our focus is on the astronomical facts underlying the legend of the Phoenix. At a fixed time, according to Pliny, the sun darkens, and Lucretius asserts that this is caused by some other body that is so infrequently appears that its rediscovery in later generations is impeded by the lapse of time. As the Euphratian records, reliefs, and seals depict, Phoenix is a winged planet. Therefore, we are to search for something off of the ecliptic plane, a planet that flies in and out of our system on an entirely different path around the sun. The ancient traditions claim that Phoenix appeared and darkened the solar orb only every 540 to 550 years, though some sources cite the period was about 500 years. As the legends are guardians of latent astronomical facts, we must look deeper into the past in our search to unveil this mystery. Because Thales predicted the exact year the sun would darken, we must assume that he had access to historical records concerning this next and more ancient solaric anomaly. Sun darkening of 1135 BC. This amazing year exemplifies how the past forms a predicate for the future. This date is 552 years before the 583 BC darkening of the sun during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. But now, in 1135 BC, Nebuchadnezzar I ruled Babylon, and discovered among his stone tablet annals is a record concerning how in this year a object darkened the sun. This fact demonstrates that the Babylonians were aware of the timing of the return of the Phoenix, which they believed was a comet, for they named their king Nebuchadnezzar II, knowing that the sun darkening of his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar I was about to transpire again. And of course, we have seen that in 583 BC the sun did darken. The concept of kingship is made more profound by the historical fact that in this year of 1135 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III became king of Assyria and began his famous military campaigns subduing all of Mesopotamia. At this time, the Assyrian monarchs employed as their great seal the winged disc. Historical astronomers have also found that at this date, the Chinese left records that the sun darkened. They would have viewed this from an angle, for the same event is preserved in the Irish traditions concerning the Tuatha De Danann. These people migrating from continental Europe campaigned against the prior residents of Ireland and Britain called the Fomori, a race of giants descended from Ham. The two armies of these people met in the Field of Towers and committed to war in the Battle of Moytura. Just as had happened in 583 BC, now in 1135 BC, during the battle the sun darkened. This fierce war is recorded in the annals of Clonmacnois. The Danann were of mixed ancestry. Semitic Achaeans that fought against the Trojans at Troy for King Agamemnon of Mycenae. As at Troy, the Danann engaged the enemy Fomori of Ireland in opposing camps separated by a duel between two champions that would fight in single combat. This was the heroic code, exactly how Israel would face the Philistines in 1027 BC when David slew the giant Goliath, the Philistine champion. The Philistines were exceptionally tall, shown as much taller than the Egyptians on temple reliefs at Karnak, and were descended from Ham. The Danaan of Archaix were originally Greeks who integrated culturally with the migrating maritime Israelite tribe of Dan that departed Canaan after having failed to defeat the Rephaim and the Anakim giants in their allotted portions of the inherited lands of Israel. Interestingly, the geographical regions that were to be Dan's inheritance were occupied by the Philistine cities of Ashdod, Ascalon, and Joppa. Phoenix is described in the Babylonian records as a comet. This is not an inaccurate assessment. However, as will be seen, Phoenix is larger than any known comet. Having a frozen exterior surface that begins burning off into a long tail, millions of miles long, ever pointing away from the sun, a comet is merely a tiny object in comparison with the enormous size of Phoenix. Their similarity lies with the fact that Phoenix too is encapsulated in immense glacial sheets that begin to burn off into spectacular cloud-like tail that engulfs the earth, darkening the sun. This is akin to the traditions of Venus, which the early Maya recorded was a planet that exhibited a tail. In fact, any moon, planet, or fragment encased in frozen liquid seas or oceans that approaches too closely to the sun's surface will give off a brilliant tail. But before we speculate any more on the nature of Phoenix, let us peer even further back into the mists of time in our search of an event 552 years before the sun darkening of 1135 BC. Sun darkening of 1687 BC. For over 100 years prior to this distant date, there was an expansive human population explosion throughout the world. Cities made of stone were erected everywhere, all with sacred temple precincts, and most of them were oriented around pyramid structures as the nations of the world attempted to replicate the Great Pyramid standing at Giza in Egypt, as this author's prior work, Lost Scriptures of Giza, serves to show. Also provided in this book is the history of an extremely old and interesting book known as the Book of Jasher, a text often confused with its forgeries. The Jasher text is twice mentioned in the Old Testament scriptures as a credible source of historical information concerning the world in patriarchal times. Within this ancient Hebraic record, we learn why the sons of Jacob killed all the men of Shechem as detailed in the Genesis narrative. The king of Shechem, a Canaanite, took by force the sister of Jacob's sons, Dinah. Her indignant brothers slew Shechem, and the news spread rapidly throughout Canaan, which at that time was filled with Amorite garrisons from the kingdom of Mitanni, the Amorite capital being Mari. Biblical chronologist Stephen Jones in his Secrets of Time, along with some other historians, date the rape of Dinah using the Jasher and other Hebraic writings at the year 1687 BC. It was in this year, within weeks after the sons of Jacob slaughtered the men of Shechem, that the kings of Canaan with Amorite troops assembled for war against the house of Jacob. A mighty host of 13 kings, with the force divided into 7 hosts, led by the Amorite king of gigantic stature named Jashub of the city of Tapnach. Following him were many of those descended from the giants. As Jacob's sons and their trained servants, 112 men in all, prepared their army and weapons of war, the patriarch Jacob despaired and cried into the sky, asking for God's deliverance. The text reads, "And when Jacob ceased praying to the Lord, the earth shook from its place, the sun darkened, and all the kings grew terrified, and a great consternation seized them. And the Lord hearkened to the prayer of Jacob, and the Lord impressed the hearts of all the kings and their hosts with terror and awe of the sons of Jacob." This was in fact a worldwide cataclysm that ended several thriving civilizations. Many of the mounds throughout Israel and Jordan today cover burned strata that date to this period. The unusual megalithic cities that baffle archaeologists today because of their most unbelievable locales were destroyed in these worldwide quakes. The earliest megalithic layers of Crete and Mycenae were formed from the collapse of their once mighty structures, and archaeologists assert that these civilizations met with disaster around 1645 BC. In a span of 37 centuries, the 42-year variance between the approximate date and the actual date of 1687 BC year is virtual bullseye. Strewn throughout the ruins where the builders dropped them have been discovered man's tools, as if the construction work was abandoned and men fled in haste. This would support the occurrence of an earthquake. One fascinating discovery underneath the ruins of Crete at Knossos was the gruesome find at the mountain shrine of Amenaspelia, where archaeologists discovered a collapsed temple wherein the skeleton of a youth was found, still bound to a shrine where he was about to be sacrificed. A bronze dagger for the deed was laying beside him. The temple ruins were preserved because the mountain collapsed upon it. This sensational find was made in 1981. Several of the world's coastlines were permanently changed and entire regions thickly populated vanished under the waves. Among them was the famous Canaanite city of Joppa, washed out by a tsunami. In South America, the ancient port city of Tiahuanaco was thrust 12,000 feet into the sky as the Andes Mountains were pushed upward, altering the entire American Pacific Atlantic coastlines and causing to be abandoned other cities such as Machu Picchu, which was now too cold and high to adequately support crops or comfortable living conditions. When the Spanish explored the ruins of Tiahuanaco, they were told by locals that it was a major city constructed after the flood by giants who disregarded a prophecy of the coming of the sun, which led to their demise. This prophecy was probably none other than the astronomical knowledge of the return of Phoenix to darken the sun and destroy parts of the earth that was to transpire in 1687 BC. The ruins are littered with monoliths weighing 60 to 200 tons that had been riveted together with silver bolts removed by the Spanish. Tiahuanaco's artifacts have been radiocarbon dated at approximately 1700 BC, which is only 13 years off. Lending credence to the traditions of gigantic men at Tiahuanaco is the discovery by archaeologists of enormous human skulls at the site that had once belonged to colossal men that stood 9 to 10 feet tall. This corroborates the biblical account of the height of the Goliath the giant, who stood 9 foot 9 inches tall. Evidence of Cataclysm near Tiahuanaco is found north of the city in the enormous ruins of Pumapunka, where 27-foot-long andesite blocks weighing as much as 300 tons were strewn about by some tremendous force. Bolivia's National Archaeological Institute has dated the massive ruins at 1700 BC. West of Tiahuanaco have been discovered greater monuments such as large gateways with hinges, platforms, and porches made of a single stone. Also, enormous gateways made of great masses of stone, some of which were 30 feet long, 15 feet high, 6 feet thick. The megalithic doors with jambs and lintels, all hewn cleverly from one single block, are characteristic of those same peculiar rock doors found by Porter north of Israel in the region of Bashan, now located in modern Syria and Lebanon, a territory anciently belonging to the Rephaim giants famous in the Old Testament. Other sites dated at this time that have the same unusual polygonal and megalithic masonry are the ruins of Palenque, Cuzco, Calasasaya, the fortress of Sacsayhuacan, as well as those in the jungle depths of the Yucatan. Just a day's walk from the ruins of Bashan lies a truly gargantuan cut and dressed stone still lying in situ in its quarry at Baalbek in Lebanon. A single stone, 69 feet in length. 3 more enormous stones, called the trilithons, were raised to a height in position and set into the walls of a foundation for some unusually large platform said in the earliest records of the site to have been the location of a pre-flood city. Archaeologists have noted that the project seemed to have come to an abrupt halt, for the craftsmen's tools were found lying about the site and the building remained unfinished. It appears that the site was being rebuilt after it had been a ruinous condition for a long time. As Baalbek parallels Tiwanaku, this Andean anomaly also mirrors the ruins far off the coast of Peru in the South Pacific, known simply as Easter Island. Easter Island was once the center of a mighty island empire controlling a vast archipelago of island kingdoms until the ocean level raised considerably, or the seafloor lowered, plunging countless islands beneath the waves. All over Easter Island are half-buried statues wearing unusual hats and mare, platform pyramids, along with what archaeologists have found to be something that is most puzzling: a heroic statue, 70 feet long, still lying in the quarry. Like the Baalbek monolith, this statue is still attached to natural rock. Further mirroring Baalbek, at the Easter Island areas where the giants' heads were being erected, archaeologists have found the craftsmen's tools still lying about where they were dropped when all construction ceased. Entire workshops strewn with tools that were never touched again. The islanders claim that ever since the disaster, traveling overseas was discontinued. Far north of Easter Island, in the Pacific on Ponape Island between Japan and Hawaii, are the basalt ruins of the mysterious city of Metalinum. This great city is 11 square miles of earthworks and megalithic masonry, colossal pillars, temple edifices, and artificial waterways of dense basement stone that could have been maintained a population of 2 million people. The city was destroyed by quakes and flooding and an evident alteration of its coasts. For a long period of time, Metalinum was underwater. We have no written records or traditions concerning it. The same fate and same time ended the civilization of Yap Island in the Carolinas. This catastrophe did not pass by China unnoticed. A series of yellow fogs, a famine, and a darkening of the sun revealed the mandate of heaven that kingship in China must be changed. And this disaster brought an end to the ruling Xia dynasty as the Tang dynasty emerged. In the year 279 BC, grave robbers in the Honan province of China excavated a royal tomb and discovered what has come to be called the Bamboo Books. In these texts, we learn that a terrible cataclysmic episode occurred in 1688 BC, of terrible earthquakes and strange astronomical omens, as well as a rain of meteoric rock. This dating and disaster is confirmed in Chinese seals. A fragment of the Bamboo Books reads, "The Emperor Kui, in his 10th year, and in Shin, 29th of the cycle, the 5 planets went out of their courses. In the night the stars fell like rain. The earth shook. The Jay and the Zhou rivers in Honan became dry." Asia provides us with more detailed data on this event. The cultures of the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts of China were once thriving forests of people and trees, but the climate of the region was drastically altered. This may be related to an observation made by the prolific researcher David Hatcher Childress, who wrote that the Mongols called the Gobi Desert by the name of Shamo, which he believed is akin to the Middle Eastern deity named Shamos, who was worshipped as a black star that was considered an evil heavenly body. This would be Phoenix. Also in Cambodia lies the formerly lost city of Angkor Wat, another city where archaeologists excavating the earlier parts of the ruins found that it was littered with stone tools that were left behind. Angkor Wat was abandoned, reoccupied, deserted, and discovered again several times in its long history. Pliny the Elder died during the volcanic activity of Vesuvius in 79 AD. At this time, the Roman luxury cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii were buried, and archaeologists have excavated marvel after marvel of preserved human bodies and animals and priceless artifacts, as well as frescoes and murals. But these scientists have found something even more profound. Unbeknownst to the Romans, Herculaneum and Pompeii were built directly over more archaic settlements that had themselves been buried under the wrath of Vesuvius. Geologists have found that this prior eruption buried everything in 90 miles from the volcano, and testing has set the earlier volcanic entombment at approximately 1780 BC. This is merely a professional estimate, albeit a good one. It is only 93 years off from the actual date of 1687 BC. This is referred to as the Avellino eruption. Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, is one of the most misunderstood monuments in the world. Sir Norman Lockyer studied the site and concluded, after extensive research, that Stonehenge complex was erected in 1680 BC. His dating is, of course, 7 years off. However, he merely discovered the date it was toppled and renovated, being Stonehenge 3. Perhaps not a coincidence, this intriguing fact was published on pages 5 and 52 of David Davidson's monumental book, The Great Pyramid, Its Divine Message. Again, 552. We have dared to gaze intently into the obscure history of our world in the search for validation of this thesis, and now we must seek to glimpse an even more remote past. As we arrive to 1687 BC after a 552-year journey from 1135 BC, which was 552 years after 583 BC, we must now peer backward another 552 years to the most dreadful and worldwide remembered catastrophe of all time, the Great Deluge. Sun darkening of 2239 BC. It is imperative that the listener know that this author did not date the deluge. The 2239 BC date derives from the meticulous chronology of Stephen Jones in his Secrets of Time, a timeline incorporating the biblical chronologies, Hebraic extra-canonical works, and Assyrian astronomical records. We arrive here simply by adding 552 years to 1687 BC. The Great Deluge nearly wiped out humanity. The mechanism by which the whole world was destroyed was by a comet impact 7 days after the transit of Phoenix. Rabbinical records indicate that the flood was caused by the appearance of two stars, one being Phoenix and the other a comet that crashed into the earth, initiating the flooding. The Great Flood is fully detailed in this author's work, Anunnaki Homeworld. The comet impacted in the area of the Gulf of Mexico. The antiquarian and author Frank Joseph, in his book The Destruction of Atlantis, cites several traditions and records concerning the darkening of the sun at the flood. But one such text that escaped him is our cherished Book of Jasher, and in this early Hebrew historical chronology of the ancient world, we read that 7 days before the flood, the Lord caused the whole earth to shake, and the sun darkened, and the foundations of the world raged, and the whole earth was moved violently, and the lightning flashed, and the thunder roared, and all the fountains of the earth were broken up, such as was not known to the inhabitants before. And God did this mighty act in order to terrify the sons of men, that there might not be more evil upon the earth. And at the end of 7 days, the waters of the flood were upon the earth. Phoenix transited, darkening the sun 7 days before the flood commenced. Dr. Frederick Philby, author of The Flood Reconsidered, theorized that the deluge may have been caused by the close pass of a wandering minor planet that collapsed the marine canopy once enveloping Earth. This theory is supported by the geographer Donald Patton, author of The Biblical Flood and the Ice Epic. He believes that not only did a planet come too close to Earth, but this body carried with it comet-like debris that rained on Earth, and that some of that water contributed to the flood. The Phoenix appearance in this year explains why the black sun has been associated to stories of the flood. The legend of the Phoenix began with the transit of Phoenix between Earth and the Sun's surface in Antiquity, when Phoenix was covered in a layer of frozen liquid. The planet's proximity to the Sun melted the ice and created a thick tail of gases and rock detritus that fragmented off the surface of the dead world. The tail, just as with comets, points away from the Sun due to solar wind, and the people of the Earth long ago, this spectacle appeared as a celestial sword approaching the world, a symbol for the judgment from God. When Earth passed into this tail of debris, planet Phoenix was directly between Earth and the Sun, and the tail in the skies, as seen from the surface of our world, would have appeared as vapory wings enveloping the Sun, causing the solar light to be choked out to a dull, dark brown dullness. The winged disk was the seal of those kings that ruled over men during the age of the Phoenix. The Phoenix legend died out after 583 BC, some Greek naturalists and writers even assuming ridiculously that the Phoenix was a bird that periodically migrated to Egypt. This was a desperate attempt to account for the cogent fascination of the ancients in the appearance of something that they called the Phoenix. From a variety of early textual sources, from Greek historians, Babylonian annals, Irish traditions, and the annals of Cro-Magnon, biblical and Hebraic texts, Chinese bamboo books, and seal inscriptions, as well as input of modern authors and chronologists, we have in these very few pages easily reconstructed the astronomical phenomenon underlying the badly misunderstood yet historically persistent legend of the Phoenix. With a casual walk through the pages of history, we now understand how Thales predicted the darkening of the sun, why Lucretius believed the sun darkenings were caused by some unknown body, and why Pliny stressed that these eclipses of the sun were unusually long. By unearthing the past do we see the future, and this tenet is no less true as when acknowledged by Thales. Phoenix still orbits the sun. It has been seen by modern astronomers. It will return at a fixed time. It is seen with perfect clarity in the apocalyptic book of the Revelation. But first, we must look even further backward through history into the times before the flood, even into the pre-Adamic world. Chapter 3: A Planet of Two Calendars. After having viewed our present condition, it may well be for us to look back and review our former history, and get a knowledge of the state of the world in former times. Jewish Rabbi Hillel III, 358 AD. We have now discovered 4 distinct dates in ancient history, all linked by 3 facts. The sun darkened each time, this occult of the sun occurring every 552 years, and these events were specifically recorded by the hands of men. The first events were in 2239 BC, and the last in 583 BC, and the intervening time between is precisely 1656 years, 552 times 3. This fact alone demonstrates for us that the Phoenix legend and cycle is the key that unlocks the secret to mankind's most archaic and important calendar. In the most distant epoch of humanity, there was a year when mankind was banished from his terrestrial paradise home and sent out to wander the earth under a curse. The Creator had given men the ability to live free from doubt and constraints, but by listening to an interpreter, mankind fell under the curse and power of those beings that defined for them good and evil. Once mankind's eyes were open, which was the sinister intent of the Anunnaki, he was no longer beyond good and evil, but was from then on a slave to his own conscientiousness. Now his conscience, his guide, man was cursed to condemn himself. He is banished into the world for a period of 6,000 years, 120 50-year jubilee periods, until the return of the chief cornerstone that the builders, or Anunnaki, rejected. This is the Savior. The 6,000 years of exile encompass the period that the redeemed among men shall refill the positions of the government of God, emptied by those Anunnaki that rebelled, the fallen ones. And once the number of the souls of men completes the spiritual pyramid, Then will the stone that is made head of the corner descend and remove the curse in the 6,000th year. The Phoenix cycle of 552 years provides us with the elusive and enigmatic year that begins the 6,000-year timeline. The Hebrew year for the Great Flood, derived easily by calculating the birth-death genealogies in the book of Genesis, was the year 1656. This 1,656-year period, or 552 times 3, is from mankind's banishment from Eden to mankind's destruction by the Great Flood in 2239 BC, which we already deduced began a 1656-year countdown to 583 BC sun darkening predicted by Thales. Thus, the latter 1656 years we have covered is merely a reduplication of the 1656 years of the pre-flood world. This gives us the date 3895 BC as the beginning of the 6,000 years of man's banishment. This time covers exactly 6 Phoenix cycles of 552 years each. Though the Hebrew chronology accurately dates the flood at 1656, chronologies after the deluge are horribly obscured, and further rabbinical torture of texts and chronologies has resulted with a modern Hebrew calendar that is 133 years off. In Genesis, the events of year 1, 3895 BC, concern how and why God cursed the earth. In Genesis, as well as several other Hebraic writings, we find mention that at that time appeared a fiery flaming sword. It appeared in the east. The sword is a symbol of judgment, reconfirming to mankind that the curse had begun and would not be lifted until the appointed time. To men, the spectacle was of an immense celestial blade in the heavens, but today we recognize that what was viewed was a large comet-like object with a long tail. Phoenix, the comet rogue planet, has now become the symbol for judgment on Earth. This meaning will hold true throughout this book, even into the coming apocalypse. Priests and scholars in Antiquity strive to determine year 1. Their studies developed into what was by Roman times called the Annus Mundi system for Year of the World, or Anno Mundi. Alexandrian scribes and historians in Egypt were familiar with the Annus Mundi chronology and spent their time attempting to correct the disparities between variant timelines. All too often, overzealous priests or Christian authors altered their own sacred calendrical systems to suit their socio-religious purposes, and then tried to justify the changes by finding parallels in Annus Mundi dating, while others modified Annus Mundi dates to correspond with assumed calendrical points in other dating methods. Over time, this dating method has resurfaced. It's been lost again, reverse research to again be reassembled, but for a while after falling back into obscurity again. Ever the victim of Roman and Muslim invasions, resulting in a loss of texts and ruined libraries, fanatical Christian and Islamic book burnings, or lost into the private collections of old Europe. The Greek astronomer and geographer Eratosthenes was in charge of the famous library of Alexandria under Ptolemy III. He studied many historical records in the 3rd century BC and was very knowledgeable of Annus Mundi dating. He believed that Egyptian dynastic records contained fragments of Genesis history. He even thought the world was spherical, and he divided the earth into 60 parts and calculated its circumference to within 200 miles of accuracy. Not too bad for a measure of 24,000 miles. Eratosthenes also drew a map of Europe, Britain, Ireland, the Mediterranean world, Arabia, Asia, and the Persian Gulf, all the way to the Horn of Africa. He even theorized of unknown continents and was an expert mathematician. We cannot lightly ignore that he used Annus Mundi dating. Flavius Josephus, author of the famed Antiquities of the Jews, was acquainted with the Annus Mundi system and even attempted to date Solomon's reign in Annus Mundi years. Josephus had access to many temple archives. Another early writer was Syncellus, who about 800 AD, preserved the Egyptian Book of Sothis, all in Annus Mundi years. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the celebrated author of History of the Kings of Britain, also used the Annus Mundi chronology to ascertain that the birth of Christ was 1008 years after the founding of the city of Londonum. Even in texts from secret societies like the Masons, we find that official society documents recorded events in history in Annus Mundi dating, like the Inigo Jones document and the Wood manuscript, that both refer to Enoch and the Great Pyramid, as well as other events in biblical patriarchal times in Annus Mundi years. The advantage of dating under the Annus Mundi system is quite clear. With years recorded in this way, we have an unbroken timeline from year one to the present, and even through the future to the year 6000, which under our present calendrical scheme is 2106 AD. Year 1, 3895 BC, has been determined in 6 very unique and independent ways. 1. Phoenix cycles of 552 years beginning with the sun darkening at the flood, involving 4 darkenings of the sun to 583 BC is 1656 years. They are the origin of the pseudo-mythical traditions of the 4 ages, or the 4 suns of olden times. Counting these same 1656 years backwards, beyond the Great Deluge of 2239 BC, which was the year 1656 AM, provides us the year 3895 BC as year 1 Annus Mundi. 2. Modern chronologist Stephen Jones, in his work The Secrets of Time, identified 3895 BC as year 1, having no knowledge of phoenix cycles, by simply calculating the periods of biblical genealogies in Genesis, king lists, Hebraic records, and Assyrian astronomical texts. 3. Apocryphal text called Book of Adam and Eve 2, composed at the Alexandrian Library from older source materials, reveals that from Jared's 40th year alive, there were still 5,500 years remaining until the end of the 6,000-year reign of man's banishment. By calculating the periods of the patriarchs in Genesis, we find that Jared's 40th year was the year 500 Hebrew reckoning, or 500 Annus Mundi. Though Stephen Jones does not include any of this data in his research, using his chronology, we find that Jared was 40 years old in the year 3395 BC. This reveals that year 1 is 3895 BC, and the 5,500 years after Jared's 40th year is the year 6000, or 2106 AD. A conceptual pattern revealing that 3895 BC is year 1 is by reviewing this amazing synchronicity herein. 3895 BC, year 1, man banished from paradise, Adam is cursed. 1948 year period to 1948 BC, which is the year 1948 Annus Mundi. Abraham is born at this calendrical nexus between the BC and the AM systems. 2 separate calendars, one going backward in time, one going forward in time. Both of them link to the birth of Abraham. Both of them together then identify year 1 as 3895 BC. This is 1948 years to 1 AD. Anno Domini, year of the Lord 1, which is a countdown of 2106 years to the return of the chief cornerstone. And in the year 1948, Anno Domini, we have Israel reborn as a sovereign nation to initiate the last days until the apocalypse and Armageddon. Number 5, Abraham's 1948 BC birth confirmed in the nigh 1,000-year-old Talmudic commentary of Rashi in Leviticus Rabbi 29:1. The fact that his birth also aligns with 1948 Annus Mundi is not without significance. Josephus and Antiquities wrote that Abraham was born in the 292nd year after the flood, which we know transpired in 1656 Hebrew reckoning. As 1948 AM is 292 years after 1656, and 1948 AM is likewise 1948 BC, we clearly find that 3895 BC is year 1. Josephus refers to Abraham's birth in Antiquities 165. Number 6. The final method of determining year 1 will require the reader to review the astonishing charts and material in this author's work, Chronotecture, The Lost Science of Prophetic Engineering, which carefully demonstrates how the geometrical dimensions and arrangements of the Great Pyramid form a gigantic timeline that records 246 famous historical and future prophesied events until the year 2106 AD, or the year 6000. The Phoenix cycle of 552 years seems to end in 583 BC, with the sun darkening during the battle between the Medes and the Lydians as predicted by Thales. The old world was waning, and the new world of antiquity we refer to as classical civilization was one of emerging Greek and Roman states that would eventually result with powerful European and even American nations. Phoenix darkened the sun no more, and the legend died out with the cultures that bred it. But this strange visitor to our solar system continued to arrive on time, almost always unseen, and yet its effect was also felt powerfully on Earth. Though the orbital synchronicity allowing for direct transits that occulted the sun ceased in 583 BC, planet Phoenix will realign in the future so that the black suns of the ancient times will terrify the world once more. In fact, it has already begun synchronizing in American history. We will review these instances and modern records later in this work. The legend of the Phoenix as transmitted through the Greeks reveal a venerable advanced astronomical science relative to a formerly known and practiced method of timekeeping. This system was practiced by the Egyptians, evidently the keepers of the secrets not only of the calendar but also of the nature and orbital chronology of Phoenix. Though Zecharia Sitchin is an undisputed authority on the Anunnaki and on the existence of Nibiru to a fault, this scholar automatically links every reference to other worlds mentioned by our predecessors that were not among those of the known system to have been Nibiru. A case in point is in when Time Began in his chapter Keepers of the Secrets, wherein he notes that on the papyrus of Queen Nejmet, the two cord holders measure the angle of a planet the Egyptian texts refer to as the red eye of Horus. To Sitchin, this is a reference to Nibiru, but more precisely this is Phoenix, which turns the heavens reddish and the moon dark red like blood. Further, the cord-holding measurements are overseen by the goddess of the calendar, and her symbol was the stylus of a palm branch, which the Egyptian scribes linked with the counting of years. The Phoenix connection is easily proven in that the early Greeks, for some unknown reason, referred to these Egyptian trees as date palms, calling them phoenixes, and traditions have for unknown purposes always linked the legend of the phoenix with these trees. And this is precisely what Phoenix allowed the ancient Egyptian chroniclers to do, to count the years and maintain the calendar. To better understand this Egyptian science, we must return to our modern chronologist Stephen Jones. In his research, he reveals that there is a definitive period of time noted throughout all of biblical chronology known as the Cursed Earth period, involving 414 years where curses were set upon and later lifted on men and nations. He notes that 1656 years until the flood was exactly 414 times 4. The flood was a judgment introduced by the curse upon mankind and his continued rebellion against the Creator. As 4 is the number for the earth, an arcane concept, 4 cursed earth periods resulted in a worldwide cataclysm because mankind ignored the effects of the curse rather than acknowledging it and seeking deliverance from his Creator, which would have been provided. What Stephen Jones did not know was that the cursed Earth system of 414 years is entirely astronomical, relating totally to the orbital period of planet Phoenix. The cursed Earth system was not unknown in early times. The Alexandrian scholar Aristarchus of Samos was studying at the library with its 500,000 texts when the ancient Parian Chronicle was composed from older sources in about 265 BC. A text referring to the Great Deluge. Aristarchus himself had written that he believed that the world was destroyed every 2484 years, a completely arbitrary number that denotes that this man must have had an educated reason for specifying some unusual span of time. We see clearly that 2484 years is exactly 414 times 6 cursed Earth periods. Such a statement infers that he had access to literature 23 centuries ago that we no longer possess. Aristarchus had patience and tenacity, as revealed by the fact that he took the time to draft the first critical editions and commentaries on Homer's epics. In order to impress upon the mind the reality of the Phoenix, its 552-year cycle and 414-year cursed Earth cycle, this author provides the following chapters which contain timelines of the history of the world interwoven in a matrix of 552 and 414-year periods. These epics connect events through human history with such amazing synchronicity that we can perfectly conclude the orbital secret to planet Phoenix. Its actual orbital longevity in years. This is simply derived by factoring the differential between 552 and 414. Phoenix enters our inner solar system every 138 years. This means that a cursed Earth period was exactly 3 orbits of Phoenix, while a Phoenix cycle involves 4 orbits. And this orbital period was specifically known to the ancient Egyptians. Discovered upon Egyptian papyri of the Osirian text as exhibited by David Davidson, the Egyptians noted a 1,656-month period of time that was directly related to the flood. While this could easily be understood as a lunar code referencing a 1656-year period, which the Egyptians were fond of doing, this is no doubt a reference to the orbit of planet Phoenix for 138 years is exactly 1,656 months. 138 times 12. This astronomical synchronicity is perfect, further revealing that the flood was indeed in 1656 Annus Mundi, Hebrew reckoning. We have additional evidence of an Egyptian origin of this advanced orbital knowledge of Phoenix's 138-year orbit. It is found in an old Jewish legend. This story explains that Jacob, in his dream of the ladder to heaven, encountered 2 angels that had been cursed because they had warned Lot about the impending fiery destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The period of time that these 2 angels were condemned to stay out of heaven was 138 years. Before we continue on with our study of this 138-year orbit of planet Phoenix, we shall now delve into the annals of history to see how the very framework of time itself involves Phoenix cycles and cursed Earth periods. Chapter 4. Phoenix Cycles Demonstrated. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. Psalm 77:5. Our history is fascinating and virtually unknown by those we trust to teach it. The Phoenix cycle, according to Mario Reading in his commentaries on the prophecies of Nostradamus, were deemed to herald the beginnings and ends of great human eras. And this is what we have thus far found to be true. We have chronicled the history of the world from 3895 BC to the flood in 2239 BC, and further on 1656 more years to 583 BC when the sun darkened after predicted by Thales of Miletus, a total period of 3312 years, or 552 times 6. This was the age of the Phoenix, the second half of this age having each 552-year period, resulting with a disaster or a major social rearrangement. This astronomical period involving the orbital cycle of planet Phoenix seems to have set a precedence throughout human history that serves to hint that the future is but an echo of the past. Though 583 BC appears to end the Phoenix cycle, this is only because the effect, the darkening of the sun, did not occur. Further, the time after 583 BC involved a complete paradigm shift in the consciousness of civilization in the Near East and Egypt as the older Semitic empires fell to Persia, which gave way to the Greeks and later to the might of Rome. As a result, the legend of the Phoenix fell into disrepute and obscurity, falling prey to the unimaginative musings of early cryptozoologists. But the cycle remained true, for precisely on schedule, Phoenix entered the inner system and back into the annals of history. Counting 552 years after 583 BC, we arrive at the year 31 BC when Rome was at civil war. Mark Antony and the famous Grecian queen of Egypt known as Cleopatra had formed an alliance, and their military forces clashed with the powerful Roman navy under the command of Octavian. Antony and Octavian vied for the supremacy of Rome, and their armies met and fought in the famous Battle of Actium. As the naval war commenced, a devastating earthquake ravaged the coast, initially killing 10,000 people from the toppling structures, though the final death toll was told to exceed 30,000 as people who later died in the rubble as the cities caught fire, burning those unable to flee from the debris. The quake afflicted Judea, the historian Josephus writing that it was believed to be the worst disaster in the history of Judea. It is an interesting coincidence that Josephus comments on this earthquake in 31 BC in Antiquity's book 15:5-2. Octavian won the struggle. Mark Antony and Cleopatra later committing suicide, with Octavian becoming the famous Augustus Caesar, who initiated a new government throughout all the Roman world, an empire that originally had as its battle standard a picture of the phoenix. The quake during the Battle of Actium parallels the quaking of the previous sun darkenings during the battle between Jacob's sons and the Canaanite kings, and that of the Tuatha Danaan against the Fomori during the Battle of Magchura, or Moichura as properly pronounced, as well as the worldwide quakes at the flood. Planet Phoenix passed during the inner system, but had fallen out of sync with Earth's position and around the sun, failing to transit. But the effect of this body's presence still met with the reactionary earthquakes. That these earthquakes were worldwide is indicated by the ruins found on the Olmeca on the other side of the world at the site now called Trezapotes. The Olmeca employed the long count calendar before the Maya had inherited it, and the last known Olmec date discovered among the ruins of this stone city was found upon Stela C and translates into our modern reckoning as 31 BC. The ruination that happened at Trezapotes may have occurred just weeks or months after this last date inscription was made. In considering the history of Rome, we cannot neglect to review its beginning. The people descended from the Trojans that lost out in the Great War in 1229 BC in Asia Minor to a naval invasion of Greek states led by the Mycenaeans, eventually settled along the banks of the Tiber River in Italy among the Etruscans, among the Latins, and the Sabines. They founded a city and called it Rome in 753 BC, which began a 552-year countdown to the end of the Second Punic War in 2001 BC, when Rome defeated Carthage, a war that began with a naval invasion by Hannibal of Carthage against the Roman territories. More on Rome shall be disclosed herein. In the year 713 BC, every calendar in the ancient world was changed. A former rock and metal moon of Nibiru almost collided into Earth, known as the Dark Satellite. Its full orbital history is revealed in Anunnaki Homeworld. This was the third regnal year of King Numa Pompilius of Rome, and he, like other regents of his day, had to modify his calendar from 360 days a year to 365.25 days. The priests of various cultures maintained the 360-day count only in their sacral systems. In 713 BC, King Sennacherib of Assyria sought to destroy Jerusalem and the temple, but his army was vaporized in a lightning blast from heaven. This was a flux tube discharge between the dark satellite and Earth, such as the one photographed between comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 and Jupiter in the year 1994. 552 years after this amazing year was 161 BC, the year the Jews cleansed the temple after the passage of the prophesied 2300 days, after the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes IV desecrated the temple with pig's blood. Amazingly, Sennacherib is famous in the scriptures for his letter to King Hezekiah of Jerusalem that claimed that no god or gods could deliver Jerusalem from the might of Assyria. And 552 years later, Antiochus himself called himself the name Epiphanes, which means God manifest or God is present. This was 161 BC when a reddish rain contaminated ponds and lakes and a plague originated in the Middle East and Persia began afflicting Roman provincial regions. Additional connections between Assyria and Syria can be found. The emerging eastern power of Media that made war against the Lydians during 583 BC sun darkening now in the year 615 BC under King Artaxerxes made war against the empire of Assyria, which was the superpower of the Middle East at the time. This began a 552-year period to 63 BC when the Roman general Pompey conquered Syria and annexed Judea and Jerusalem as a provincial territory of Rome, the Western superpower of the time. Assyria is connected to Rome in another startling way. In the year 607 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, noted primarily in this book for reigning during the 583 BC sun darkening, who was descended from Nebuchadnezzar I, who reigned during the 1135 BC sun darkening, utterly defeated the Assyrian army. The 10 tribes of Israel that had forcibly settled amongst the Sumerian and Scythian peoples by the Assyrians deported away from Israel in 745 BC, exactly 138 years before Assyria's army fell to Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. Many of these descendants of Israel, now mixed among the Germanic peoples, fled Asia and began dispersing throughout Asia Minor, parts of Greekdom, and Europe. They had fully assimilated the Assyrian program, with the Germanic deportees and reappeared at this time on the world scene under their new identities as the Celts and Gauls. These peoples formed kingdoms all around the fringes of the Roman provincial territories throughout Europe as far as Iberia, Spain, which preserves the name Hebrew Iberia, as does the river Ebro. Nebuchadnezzar's victory began a 552-year countdown to Julius Caesar's Roman invasion of Britain in 55 BC, the greatest of Celtic strongholds. The Babylonian victory and violence against the formerly oppressive Assyrians was a shock felt throughout the ancient world, heralding to the people of the Near East that a change was coming, just as the unprecedented invasion of Britain over the English Channel. Nebuchadnezzar's victory marked the 666th year since Assyria had first become an empire in 1273 BC, when Assyria annexed Babylon and adopted the winged disc phoenix as its official great seal, an emblem both Rome and then the United States would adopt prior to changing this legendary bird symbol to that of an eagle. Amazingly, as we will see in Chapter 7, this year of 1273 BC was the exact year Planet Phoenix entered the inner system. This was the start of the Assyrian Empire, which would go through phases and later lose territories to acquire them again, such as in the case of the rebellion of Babylon. Exactly 144 years after 1273 BC, the city of Babylon would be reconquered by the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I in 1129 BC. The Assyrian deportation program removing the 10 tribes of Israel lasted 24 years, starting in 745 BC. The final year, the remaining tribes were taken into Assyria and settled among other subdued nations was 721 BC under Sargon II, precisely 552 years after 1273 BC, the beginning of the Assyrian Empire. Intriguingly, counting 552 years before 745 BC, we arrive at the earlier invasion of Israel in 1297 BC, when the Canaanite general Sisera subdued the tribes of Israel and made them pay tribute. They were later delivered by Barak and Deborah in 1277 BC. In 931 BC, the 10 tribes of Israel split from the kingdom of Judah, effecting the establishment of the two kingdoms, mirroring the earlier Egyptian two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. 1,000 years exactly after this political subdivision was the fateful year of 70 AD, when the Romans under Vespasian and his son Titus conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. The year was 3964 Annus Mundi. The kingdom of Judea was crushed by the legions, and Josephus reported that over 1 million Jews died defending their city or were executed afterward, and that 97,000 people were sold in the slave markets. The fields were salted, just as the Romans had done to Carthage, and the temple relics and artifacts were all taken to Rome, and reliefs of them were immortalized upon the Arch of Titus. This virtual end of the Jewish nationality began a 552-year period to the emergence of another enemy of the Jews, Islam, and the start of the Muslim calendar in 622 AD, known as the Hijra. The Hijra calendar is adhered to today for the entire Islamic world, a culture that shares an ancestral animosity with the Jews passed down from patriarchal times concerning ownership of the land of Israel and Palestine. Muslim armies invaded modern Israel in their 1948 Independence War, Six-Day War, and Yom Kippur War. In 312 AD, the Roman realms are again engaged in civil war. On his way to subdue his rival Maxentius, Emperor Constantine the Great sees a comet while en route with his army. The event eventually ignited his conversion to Christianity, or was used as a ploy to justify it. Though we will not indulge in the 414-year cursed earth periods until the next chapter, it is not to be missed that this comet appeared in the skies precisely 1242 years, or 414 times 3, prior to the end of the 6,000-year timeline that began in 3895 BC and ends in 2106 AD. The return of the chief cornerstone. This comet was seen over Europe 552 years before the year 864 AD, when the Irish annals record that both a lunar and a solar eclipse transpired. While the lunar eclipse may have occurred, astronomers note that no solar eclipses happened in this year, and they are correct, to the extent that the moon did not occult the sun, for we now have demonstrated how a comet transiting between the earth and the sun will darken the solar orb with its debris tail, which envelopes earth. This was not Phoenix, but a large comet with an orbit detailed fully in Anunnaki Homeworld. Julius Caesar was born in 101 BC. A man who brought immense changes to the Roman government and culture. Some believe he's the beginning of the Roman Empire. He became a dictator and was lamented as the cause of the fall of the Republic and emergence of the Caesars that followed him, curtailing many of the powers and privileges of the Senate. By his exploits did Rome become feared in all the courts of the Eurasian African nations, no kingdom inaccessible to Italy. As he was infamous, so too, 552 years after his birth, did an infamous invader attack Italy in 452 AD, named Attila the Hun, from regions so far away that the Romans had never heard of. But this was not the first shock Rome had felt in their early Anno Domini years. On August 24th, 410 AD, at midnight, the Salarian Gate of Rome was quietly opened, and Alaric the Goth led the Visigothic army into the Eternal City, initiating the infamous sack of Rome. These Germanic hosts invaded the city and ransacked its private and public buildings, treasuries, galleries, storehouses, and temples. This emotional and humbling event inspired Augustine to compose his renowned work titled City of God, in which he noted with awe that never before had an invasion force ransacked an entire city, leaving all of its Christian shrines and sanctuaries untouched. Why this amazed Augustine is truly the mystery, for Christianity had early on swept through the German kingdoms at the borders of the Roman provincial territories like an uncontrollable fire. In fact, the spirit of Christian Germania would go on to forge the history of Europe itself. This sack of Rome was 552 years before the founding of the Holy Roman Empire of Germany, which began when Otto I was crowned emperor by Pope John XII at Nuremberg. We should not be surprised to learn that the Holy Roman Empire adopted as its seal the double-headed phoenix. This alliance between the Papacy, Italy, and Germany would reoccur in World War II. In the year 762 AD, the Abbasid dynasty makes Baghdad its capital, the seat of Muslim authority, effectively establishing a second Babylon. The year 1314 AD was 552 years later when the whole of the Middle East, Europe, and Asia reported unusual astronomical signs and disturbances. European historians reported a great black darkness in the night skies, while on the other side of the world, during the daytime, the Chinese recorded the sun darkened. This date was one of meteoric rain, plague fogs, strange mists, and terrible earthquakes. This was not Planet Phoenix. The event and phenomenon is fully expounded in Anunnaki Homeworld, for this was the last time the Anunnaki planet Nibiru passed through the inner system before it returns during the apocalypse. One of the most distinct denominators between these events is the fact that Babylon is the biblical symbol for all oppressive religions, and this symbol often refers to both Islam as well and the Papacy of Rome, which assumes itself to be the true authority of the Christian world, which, of course, is not true. It was in 1314 AD that Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake, officially ending the Knights Templar, an organization that had protected church interests for many years but fell to the greed and envy of a conspiracy between the papacy officials and King Philip IV of France, who had ruthlessly tortured to death 36 knights, burned 54 of them at the stake, and confiscated all their estate and wealth that he could find. This oppressive nature of the church leads us to our next 552-year period. In 1314 AD, as 1314 AD was 552 years after 762 AD, so too does 1314 AD begin a 552-year timeline to 1866 AD, when the major European kingdoms of France, Spain, Austria, and others renounced Roman Catholic papal authority, and the sovereign pope within the Vatican was stripped of his power over most of Europe. It had been earlier prophesied that the papacy would fall in this year of 1866, centuries before the event by the chronologist Heidelberg, as well as Cellarius, Parius, Gressner, and Fleming, all having specified the year 1866 as the fall of the papacy. Also of interest concerning this unique year is the fact that it was exactly 3,312 years, or 552 times 6, after the exodus of Israel from Egypt in 1447 BC, after the 10 plagues devastated Africa. These 3,312 years parallel the entire longevity of the Age of the Phoenix. In 1447 BC, the volcanic mountain of Santorini exploded and caused tsunamis, earthquakes, and severe atmospheric contamination. And in 1866 AD, there was again volcanic activity at Santorini in the Aegean. One of the most unusual 552-year alignments again involves Islam and the Hebrews. In 1356 AD, a major earthquake shocks Egypt and destroys the final vestiges of the Pharaoh's lighthouse, an immense structure wherein was composed by Hebrew scholars the famous Greek Septuagint translation of the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, in the 3rd century BC. The quake dislodged some of the gigantic white polished facing blocks on the original exterior of the Great Pyramid, exposing for the first time the core inner limestone blocks of the monument that ascend 203 levels upward to the empty platform 454 feet above the plateau. These massive 20-ton casing blocks are smashed off the pyramid as local Muslims mine the Giza site for building materials to rebuild the earthquake-shattered city of Cairo. This earthquake was 552 years before another series of disasters and quakes that transpired in 1908. In 1908 AD, over 900 witnesses watched a brilliant light trailing flames traverse the skies over Siberia. The object exploded in the air and destroyed 300 square miles of dense wood over Tunguska, Siberia, even knocking people off their feet 100 miles away. The pressure of the blast affected barometers in England, and sunsets for weeks were made beautiful by atmospheric dust. Radioactive traces of iridium, mostly an extraterrestrial element, from this comet reveal that the object weighed about 7 million tons. This occurred on June 30th. On December 28th at 5:20 a.m. in 1908, a major earthquake rocked Messina in Sicily, followed by a tsunami 26 feet high that wreaked destruction throughout the city and pulled many people out to sea as the waters receded. Gas lines busted and fires raged uncontrollably for a total death toll of 120,000 people. These earthquakes were 552 years apart. The link between the Israelites and Egypt is made more profound by a startling archaeological confirmation made in 1908. After an archaeologist named Neville in 1883 claimed to have found evidence proving the Exodus story in the walls of the Egyptian ruins of the city of Pithom, another archaeologist named Kyle traveled to Egypt and researched the site himself in 1908. He concluded that the evidence was real, that the walls of the city of Pithom exhibited at the lowest courses of masonry normal clay, brick, straw content. However, the middle courses were deficient in their amounts of traces of straw, and the uppermost courses had no straw at all. This was confirmation of the biblical Exodus story, where we learn that Pharaoh in Egypt made the Israelites erect structures with clay-burned bricks, shortening their straw rations over and over again. A further parallel of this scenario is found when considering that the Muslim extraction engineers were removing the bricks, the stone casing blocks, off of the Great Pyramid to rebuild their buildings and mosques, the Great Pyramid site known biblically as Goshen, where the Israelites in Egypt lived. They could see the enormous pyramid every day, and it was common knowledge of the times that the structure had been erected by their own Sethite ancestors before the flood. The story of the origin and purpose of the Great Pyramid is covered extensively in my work, The Lost Scriptures of Giza. Not surprisingly, our final 552-year period is also the last 552-year epoch possible in the 6,000-year timeline of man's banishment. It was the year 1554 AD when a comet recorded by European astronomers passed through the night skies. This comet appeared 552 years prior to the year 6000 Annus Mundi, or 2106 AD. 1554 AD is the year 5448 Annus Mundi, this being the precise height of the Great Pyramid in pyramid inches. 5448. This 552 years measures the time length until the chief cornerstone will descend from heaven and remove the curse that had afflicted mankind since the year 3895 BC. He will, for his millennial kingdom, reunite all the descendants of Israel and Judah, as well as Abraham and all those grafted into the divine family by faith. And again, we are not surprised to find that 1554 AD is exactly 2484 years, or 414 times 6, after the split between Israel and Judah in 931 BC at King Solomon's death. This 552 years inch dimension is clearly found in the width of the ceiling of the subterranean chamber deep below the Great Pyramid as seen in chronotecture. Our review of some of the historic phoenix cycles complete, we now delve into the archives of history as it unfolded through the patterns of cursed earth periods. Chapter 5. Cursed Earth Periods. Have you then deciphered the beginning, that you ask about the end? For where the beginning is, there shall be an end. Blessed is the man who reaches the beginning. He will know the end. Words of Jesus, Gospel of Thomas. A cursed earth period is 414 years, a time frame easily detected through the narratives of the Old Testament. One such example begins in 2235 BC, 4 years after the Great Flood. Noah was drunk from the produce of his vineyard, both he and his wife Naamah lying naked. His youngest son, Ham, also known as Kim, sees this and, captivated by the beauty of his own mother, lies with her. His brothers Japheth and Shem are made aware of the trespass, and in Genesis it reads that they walked backwards with a blanket to cover her so as not to view her body. They took this precaution because under patriarchal law it was a curse to see your father's nakedness, which Levitical law explains simply means looking upon the exposed body of your father's wife. When two sexually united marriage they become one flesh. The trespass was against Noah, and he discovers the matter when Naamah is pregnant. She gives birth to Canaan, child of the curse of Noah. The passage reads, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." Canaan's progeny bore this curse. He became patriarch over the 7 tribes that grew into a populous Canaanite nations, who against the advice of Ham violated the law of the lots and took residence in a land belonging to Shem and his descendants. This land was in turn called Canaan, the allotted inheritance of the Israelites. In the year 1821 BC, the Philistines stole a well belonging to Abraham, this being the 414th year of the curse of Noah. The Philistines were descendants of Ham. As retainers, Abraham had among his servants the huge Anakim giants, famous in Scripture, as well as many friends and allies, and as in Genesis 14 through 15 clearly reveals, he was capable of making war against Philistia. But their king, named Abimelech, a royal title of Philistine kings, profusely apologized for the trespass of his shepherds. He offered gifts and a peaceful settlement. This story is recorded in Genesis and in the book of Jasher. To remove a boundary stone or steal a well was punishable by death and adhered to as sort of an international code of statutory ethics. What Abimelech did not know was that his people were under a curse and that they had even established the means by which they were to suffer under it. However, this means was averted by the wise actions of King Abimelech of Philistia. The curse was not dispelled, but it was delayed. The Philistines were saved by wisdom. However, Abraham in that year was also afflicted by the Canaanites who also illegally occupied the land. And unfortunately for them, the curse was made firm against the whole of the cities of Canaan. Exactly 414 years after Abimelech's wisdom rescued his people from a judgment of God, Abraham's descendants marched across the Jordan River at the death of Moses, but led by Joshua, and first destroyed the Canaanite city of Jericho, then over 100 others in 1407 BC. The Canaanites, with their Amorite allies, gathered to repel the Israelites in a massive host that was immediately routed and killed off by meteoric rain, earthquake, and unleashing evil angels among these Hamitic peoples, and the continual slaughter from the blades of Israel. As Joshua directed the course of the battle for Canaan, the sun stood in the sky, and the moon ceased moving for a period of 20 hours as the Israelites routed and hunted down their Canaanite enemies. This was 2 cursed earth periods, or 828 years after the curse of Noah. The solaric standstill will be detailed later in this book as it related specifically to planet Phoenix. Interestingly, as their Canaanite neighbors were being eradicated, the Philistine cities along the coast were left unmolested by Israel, enjoying a temporal immunity from the curse. This conquering by the Israelites was the conquest of Canaan, 40 years after the exodus from Egypt in 1447 BC. 1 cursed earth period of 414 years after this was the year the very first king of Israel, Saul, became cursed by God in 1033 BC. This is how this story unfolds. In 1447 BC, the Israelites, led by Moses, away from a cataclysmic torn Egypt, were passing around the domain of the Amalekites after Moses was specifically instructed by God to stay away from the region of the Philistines. Evidently, they were still receiving immunity from the curse. As the train was over 1.5 million people traversed these wastes, Agag of the Amalekites had his soldiers attack the defenseless and scattered van, taking loot and prisoners that he never returned. In rage, Moses cursed the Amalekites. Precisely 414 years later, the Israelites were at war with the Amalekites in 1033 BC, who were of the progeny of Ham. And through the prophet Samuel, God instructed King Saul to kill them all and to execute Agag, which is a regal title of Amalek. But when Saul captured Agag, he was taken aback by the enormity of the man, a human colossus, for Agag was a descendant of the giants. He must have been truly heroic in stature, because the scriptures clearly read that Saul himself was a head taller than the tallest among Israel. Despite knowing that Amalek was cursed by their venerable ancestor Moses, Saul refused to slay Agag, fully taking upon himself the curse. Samuel the prophet, to avert a national disaster, transference of the curse upon Israel, took up the sword and executed Agag, making the curse upon King Saul personally. The king of Israel, now bearer of the curse, his reign was instantly plagued with a series of defeats in a constantly returning war against the Philistines. For 22 years, the Philistines oppressed Israel, led by a military aristocracy of giants and their offspring who had escaped Canaan in 1407 BC when the Israelites were routing the Canaanites. The scriptures read that the Rephaim and Anakim giants took up residence among the Philistines in 1407 BC. In the days of Saul, the principal threat was the giant Goliath of Gath, who had previously even stolen the Ark of the Covenant. But later the Philistines voluntarily returned the Ark to Israel after it was blamed for an extensive epidemic. After the passage of 22 years of unceasing conflicts, Saul and his son Jonathan are killed by the Philistines in 1011 BC after Saul reconfirmed his curse by not consulting God in his trouble, but the witch of Endor. It was none other than the spirit of the prophet Samuel that visited him under the divination of the witch, informing Saul of the curse. Saul was Israel's first king, and like their leader, the people too rebelled against the ordinances of God. Among the cities of Israel were surviving remnants of the Canaanites, who were supposed to have been killed in consequence to the curse and their violation of the law of the lots. To learn more about these patriarchal and ancestral covenants, read King of the Giants, Mighty Hunter of World Mythology, This is a work that has been released on Gumroad. It's in the links below. The people lost their first king, 1011 BC, and 414 years later in 597 BC, the people of Israel lost all of their original sacred temple artifacts and relics when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem and the temple precinct. This resulted in the loss of 1,000 golden cups, 29 silver censers, 1,000 silver cups, 30 golden vials, and 2,410 silver vials, and 1,000 other vessels. These same holy vessels are what cursed Babylon in 537 BC when King Nabonidus, son of Nebuchadnezzar II, used the holy temple vessels in a palace banquet party, some say an orgy. The finger of God appeared on the wall and wrote Min, Tekel, Upharsin, and on the wall in the exact same night after Daniel interpreted this to mean that Babylon would fall by the Medes and Persians. The city of Babylon at that exact time was taken by surprise without a fight, and King Nabonidus was killed. The temple relics are related to the cursed earth system in another profound way. Again, they are associated with Babylon. And in a most startling way, our history here interweaves through the tapestry of time back to Nebuchadnezzar II and his son Nabonidus. The temple relics, artifacts, and the foundation of the temple itself were made and laid in the year 967 BC by King Solomon, which was 2928 Annus Mundi, this being his fourth regnal year over Israel. This is exactly 480 years after the Exodus in 1447 BC, as described in the scriptural chronology. King Hiram of Phoenicia provides lumber and metal workers for the holy project. This 967 BC year began a 414-year cursed timeline to the healing of Nebuchadnezzar II and the first regnal year of his son Nabonidus in 553 BC. Nebuchadnezzar had previously, 7 years earlier, insulted the Creator and was specifically cursed by God to suffer lycanthropy, to become mentally deranged to the extent that he assumed canine and bestial characteristics, forgetting his own identity for a period of 7 years. In the 414th year, the king was healed of this condition. The Babylonian court officials and nobility kept the matter private and confined Nebuchadnezzar II for the designated period, having had assured by the prophet Daniel, high in the king's court, that the condition would pass. King Nebuchadnezzar's remarkable testimony of the God of Daniel is preserved in the book of Daniel. Many other examples of the cursed earth system abound. In the year 2291 BC, the seventh king of the Anunnaki assumed the throne at Shuruppak before the Great Flood, named Ubar-Utu. He oppressed the people, introduced unprecedented evils, and his reign serves as a prophetic model of the draconic rulership of the Antichrist during the apocalypse. The Anunnaki are cursed and have made a covenant with the evil one. Exactly 414 years after the emergence of Ubar-Utu, whose reign was ended by the flood in 2239 BC, Abraham, patriarch of many peoples, enters into a covenant with God in 1877 BC. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations and that his progeny would be as numerous as the stars of heaven. He was also informed that the beginning of the fulfillment of this promise would result in 430 years that his people would be in bondage under Egyptian authority. God commanded the patriarch to travel to Egypt in this year, thus beginning the 430 years to the deliverance of the descendants, the Israelites, in the Exodus led by Moses in 1447 BC. The worldwide Diluvian disaster that ended the reign of the seventh Anunnaki king in 2239 BC began itself a 414-year period to 1825 BC. This was the year that Abraham had concluded his 144th month, 12 years in Egypt, translating the writings upon the four faces of the Great Pyramid, which was his second trip to Egypt. Abraham was taught how to interpret the ancient Sumerian text from before the flood, taught by none other than the ancient Noah before he had died. This subject of the pyramid's writings is covered in my book, The Lost Scriptures of Giza. This was also the year that planet Phoenix passed through the inner system, being the year 2070 Annus Mundi, or 414 times 5. In this year, Abraham was providing hundreds of scholars from around the world detailed historical, prophetical, and wisdom literature translated from the pyramid's writings, knowledge that would later become the core foundational data spread throughout the world's oldest scientific and religious books. This college of dissemination was ordained by God and is the reason why so many civilizations in antiquity, having no contact with another, maintain the same concepts, same histories, and same beliefs about the future. In 1899 BC, the empire of Mesopotamia, seated at Akkad and ruled by Sargon I, was shattered in a devastating earthquake and lightning storm from heaven as the dark satellite nearly collides into Earth. The Akkadian ruler was almost finished with a gigantic pyramidal structure known to us as the Tower of Babel, built by the aid of Anakim giants known in traditional lore as the Titans. The people and their cultures fragmented, and many whole groups migrated to distant parts of the earth, fleeing the tyranny of Sargon I, as well as seeking newer pastures to build their own cities. It was 414 years after this episode that the Ephraimites, descendants of Joseph, patriarch of the Israeli tribe of Joseph, son of Jacob, prematurely attacked Canaan, even after they were warned that it was not the allotted time. These overzealous warriors were virtually eradicated. 30,000 men of Ephraim with only 10 survivors, by none other than the Philistine army. Also in this year, Caleb was born, who would later be one of the 12 spies of Israel and the conqueror of the Canaanites. In 1639 BC, the patriarch of Israel, Jacob, died. Before his death in Egypt, on his deathbed, he summoned Joseph and his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph at this time was Grand Vizier of all Egypt under the Hyksos dynasty, seated at Memphis. Inspired by God in conformance with the Abrahamic covenant, Jacob adopts Joseph's sons as his own. These two tribes effectively become one, the 13th tribe of Israel, the tribe of adoption. This year was 414 years before the sun darkening of 1135 BC, when the Israelite descendants of the tribe of Dan, which is later excommunicated from the family of Israel, engaged the Firbolgs in ancient Ireland in the Battle of Moytura, the Fomori being kin to the Philistines. It was also during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I. This amazing synchronicity of parallels and cycles continue here in a remarkable way. The 1135 BC sun darkening by the transit of Phoenix began itself a 414-year countdown to 721 BC, when the Assyrian king Sargon II deported the remaining tribes of Israel, among them the descendants of Manasseh and Ephraim, who would later migrate deeper into northern Asia and Europe, Asia Minor, and eventually cross the English Channel into the Britannic Isles, ancient Albion or Britain, in the Atlantic Ocean, founding the 13 colonies that would emerge into the United States of America. This deportation began the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant that his seed would become many mighty nations. 721 BC was two cursed earth periods, 828 years after Jacob's death in 1639 BC. The deportation of Israel, while Kingdom of Judah remained intact, began in 745 BC with Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser, known biblically as Pul. This deportation was amazingly 2070 years, or 414 times 5, Anno Pyramid, or 2070 years after the completion of the Great Pyramid of Egypt at Giza in 2815 BC. The year 1080 Annus Mundi, which is fully covered in Chronicon timelines of the ancient future. The deportation begins the post-exilic chronology, a countdown of 2520 years, or 360 times 7, to the founding of the United States of America, the last days empire of adoption in the western land of promise in 1776 AD. Amazingly, the 414th year of the post-exilic chronology was 331 BC, the exact year that the Anunnaki planet Nibiru entered the inner system from the deep, the nether region of the solar system below the ecliptic, at the exact time that Alexander the Great's army from Grecia defeated the Persian forces in the Battle of Gaugamela, routing King Darius and beginning Western imperialism when Alexander sat on the throne of Babylon. As previously related in our review of Phoenix cycles, we learned that in 1687 BC the sun darkened while the sons of Jacob battled the Canaanites. This event was caused by the transit of Phoenix. Counting 414 years later, we arrive at 1273 BC, the start of the Assyrian Empire with the annexation of Babylon. Phoenix passed through the inner system in this year, and the Assyrians adopted the winged disc as their great seal. Counting yet another 414 years, we come to 859 BC. Evidence taken from Assyrian seals and palace reliefs show that the Assyrians were expecting the return of the winged disc, the phoenix, according to Zechariah Sitchin. The phoenix was the antediluvian sign of kingship from the days of Enoch. In this year, King Shalmaneser III succeeded his father, Ashurnasirpal II, who had previously captured the coastal cities of Old Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. The famous black obelisk of Shalmaneser III depicts a relief of the Israelite King Jehu, also named in the scriptures, kneeling before the Assyrian monarch and paying tribute. Above Jehu, in the relief, is the winged phoenix. This year of 859 BC was during the reign of the 32nd king of Cuzco in Peru. Montesinos, the historian of the Andes, wrote that the 32nd king of Cuzco reigned exactly 2070 years after the start of Peruvian reckoning. That's 414 times 5. This date is 548 years after the 1407 BC conquest of Canaan, 15th king of Cuzco, with a period of 17 kings reigning an average of 32 years each. This 2070-year Peruvian timeline began in 2929 BC, exactly 20 years before the end of the reign of Enoch, who is remembered as the most famous of all chronologists. And of course, 2929 BC is a phoenix year. With Assyria and media so prevalent in our studies of phoenix cycles and cursed earth periods, we are not astounded to uncover more alignments involving both. In 615 BC, King Artaxerxes of Media began a war against the Assyrian Empire, and 414 years after this war began, the Punic War between Rome and Carthage ended in 201 BC. The Carthaginians were the descendants of the Phoenicians, and both Rome and Carthage were the Mediterranean superpowers in 201 BC, just as in the Middle East, in 615 BC, Media and Assyria were the superpowers. Just 1 year after the start of the Medo-Assyrian War of 615 BC, in 614 BC, Median forces destroyed the Assyrian city of Ashur, and the Medes forged an alliance with Babylon. And 414 years later, Rome declared war and marched against King Philip IV of Macedon in their struggle to dismantle the Macedonian kingdoms. 2 years into this Medo-Babylonian alliance against Assyria, the Assyrian cities of Nimrud and Nineveh were laid waste under Nebuchadnezzar II. This too began 414-year countdown to 195 BC, when Roman forces laid waste to Macedonian citadels and cities in their war against King Philip IV. As we begin to conclude our review of the old world through the window of cursed earth time, it is important that we look back to the beginning of the cursed earth system, which began in 3895 BC with man's banishment from paradise. The 2070th year of the Annus Mundi timeline ended 414 years after the Great Flood in 2239 BC, or the year 1825 BC, which was the year Abraham was translating the Giza text from off the surfaces of the Great Pyramid. While this may appear innocuous, there is a much deeper relation between these two events, separated by a span of 2070 years, or 414 times 5. This startling connection concerns the Word of God. In 3895 BC, year 1 Annus Mundi, mankind was ousted from Eden because he allowed a translator, the serpent, to explain to him the word of God, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, rather than accepting it obediently. Humanity then discerned that there was a difference between good and evil, and this revelation caused people to doubt themselves and condemn everything they had formerly enjoyed, actions previously sanctioned by God because mankind was faultless. Mankind was cursed. Cut off from the word, man wandered the earth, multiplied, built their cities and civilizations, refused to listen to those prophets and priests, the interpreters man chose, that warned them of the coming worldwide destructions of humanity and the earth itself, the great flood. Now, 414 years after this cataclysm, humanity had rebounded and was multiplying rapidly. News spread abroad of the discovered monument from before the flood that exhibited the original writings of the Word of God, found half buried in the sands of Egypt. This was the Great Pyramid of Giza, which had remained beneath the waters of the Mediterranean along with the entire delta region of Egypt's coast for 340 years after the flood until the year 1899 BC. A massive quake shoved this area upward, which is why Egypt was referred at this time as the Raised Land. Mounds of sand and seashells were removed, and sages and scholars from as far as India traveled to Egypt to hear the prophet and scribe Abraham, later to remembered as Brahma, read his translations to the Word of God found on the casing blocks of the gigantic pyramid. These translations became core source materials for the oldest religious and mythical texts in the world. It was in 1825 BC, Abraham's 12th year, translating these immense writings that men yielded to the Word of God, exactly 2070 years after man first succumbed to the words of a being that deceived them. Lost Scriptures of Giza serves to cover all of this history. The period of 2070 years, 414 times 5, is 207 times 10 years, not merely a mathematical fact, but an astronomical one. As 207 years is half of 414-year cursed Earth period, we are confronted with an intriguing fact. 2446 BC was the year 1449 Annus Mundi. A 5-planet alignment of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn formed a ladder in the sky as recorded by Chinese astronomers. This planetary alignment was 207 years before the Great Flood in 2239 BC. The deluge ended an epic, the antediluvian world, and the year was the synchronization between the Phoenix cycle and the cursed Earth systems. For this year was 552 times 3, or 414 times 4, both of them equaling 1656 years. But 207 years here at this time infers that the pattern is incomplete. And this is indeed the case. Though this is not the subject matter of this work, this author has written extensively on the pre-Adamic world and its destruction in the year 4309 BC, in Return of the Fallen Ones, a huge tome entitled Chronicon. The ruination of the pre-Adamic world actually begins the cursed earth chronology, and as we will find toward the end of this work, is a calendar intimately connected to the Great Pyramid's Giza course countdown calendar that sequentially counts down Earth's final 204 years until the return of the chief cornerstone in the year 6000, or 2106 AD. This pre-Adamic catastrophe happened precisely 414 years before mankind was banished from paradise, which began the 6,000 years of his exile. Thus, from the end of the pre-Adamic earth to the end of humanity at the Great Flood passed exactly 2070 years. Within the context of these historical timelines is unveiled the secret to the orbital length of planet Phoenix. The great 552-year Phoenix cycle began with the curse of man in 3895 BC when he was ousted from Eden, but the 414-year cursed earth timeline is more ancient, not starting in 3895 BC, year 1 Annus Mundi, but 414 years before in 4309 BC with the end of pre-Adamic Earth. It is imperative that the reader recall this fact later in this study, that the Phoenix cycle system is specifically prefixed with a 414-year cursed earth period, for the end always lies in the beginning. Our review of the old world is finished. Let us now peer into more contemporary times. And with this ends the first video of 2 videos to cover this book, When the Sun Darkens. This was written when I was a Christian many years ago, and it was written when I was 100% believer in the heliocentric system. The only difference that this text would be from today is that I have a tremendous amount more Phoenix data, and none of the actual dates change. Only what changes is my perception of the world and what the Phoenix is. In both the description box and the comment section below, you will find my personal email. Ask me any questions. You have video ideas, I'd like to hear them. And if you want to donate, all those buttons are accessible below. Playlists and everything you might need, access to the gates to my websites.